Through war, accidents, and disasters, more than one airplane, ship, and vehicle became the stuff of legends after it was lost. One such legend is that of a warplane, Swamp Ghost. But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Among military circles, there was an extreme desire to see Swamp Ghost uncovered after the Pearl Harbor warplane went down in a mysterious area, one that wasn't found until years later in the most unlikely of places. According to the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, the plane that would eventually come to be known as Swamp Ghost was originally just one of many B-17E Flying Fortresses that the Boeing company produced from a factory in Seattle, Washington. But while its legend wouldn't be established for years, it is nonetheless known that it was completed on November 28, 1941. At that point, the United States had not entered World War II, but the nation was already preparing for it. According to the National World War II Museum, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor came as a preemptive strike intended to prevent U.S. intervention as the island nation's military invaded Western colonies in Asia. Pursuant to this, their Navy sent 6 aircraft carriers a few hundred miles north of Hawaii. From those carriers, Japanese aircraft conducted a daring raid on the naval base that completely surprised American commanders. In 90 minutes, 19 warships were damaged, 300 were destroyed, and 2 400 sailors had lost their lives. Soon after landing at Fort Douglas, Swamp Ghost was transferred to Sacramento, but as the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum noted, the sudden attack led to a sudden change in the plane's location and designation. 10 days after Pearl Harbor, the B-17E Flying Fortress flew to Hickam Field in Hawaii. Given the aircraft's size, there weren't many other places that could have accommodated it, but while this new location still doesn't explain its association with Pearl Harbor, its next stop does. From there, the plane that would later be called Swamp Ghost was then assigned to the U.S. Navy, which then completed the thread of its American travels and explained what it had to do with Pearl Harbor. But while it wouldn't be long before it saw action, it had to stay grounded for a while. By 1942, America's forces had stabilized enough that the B-17E Flying Fortress was ready to take to the skies. But while it would later take part in a historic mission, its first flights in action were a little more humble. Throughout its time in Hawaii, Swamp Ghost would take off from Hawaii's Wheeler Field and patrol the area on the hunt for German submarines. After all, the last thing the nation's war effort needed was to see another attack on its bases in Hawaii. On February 11, 1942, the Flying Fortress left Hawaii and conducted what the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum described as an island-hopping flight through the Pacific. However, this wasn't such a dramatic flight, as its only objective for this leg of the journey was to reach its new home base. That would turn out to be Townsville, in the Australian state of Queensland, where the plane arrived 9 days later. And it would only stay there for 2 days before its 9-man crew played their roles in a historic engagement. On the evening of February 22, Swamp Ghost was part of America's first strategic campaign that saw a coordinated attack by bombers. This mission involved flying over Papua New Guinea, which was one of the territories Japan had conquered in the midst of the Pearl Harbor attack. Specifically, the B-17E Flying Fortress's crew was aiming for ships that approached the coastal town of Rabaul. In so doing, they sought to effect a key aspect of the war that casual observers often forget about. Alongside 8 other bombers, Swamp Ghost was poised to attack Japanese merchant ships that would otherwise supply the forces occupying Papua New Guinea. If they were able to stop or at least severely reduce the number of ships reaching Rabaul's shores, they could ensure shortages among those forces. Although 6 planes out of the planned 9 made it into the air, only 5 of them would end up making it to the insertion point over Rabaul. And once again, this loss of a plane didn't have anything to do with any enemy action. This attack was taking place at night to make the planes harder to engage, but this shrouding effect backfired one of the B-17s involved. That's because it got lost in the night clouds and had to turn back. The problems that plagued the squadron only intensified as the mission progressed. According to the Smithsonian Magazine, their pilots were largely inexperienced. They were working with incomplete maps, dealing with bad weather, and mechanical problems beset the planes themselves. All of these issues converged to leave Swamp Ghost far less supported than its crew had expected during this campaign. In fact, only one other plane would be left flying alongside it when it reached the target area. Although the dark clouds had forced one of the other B-17s to disengage earlier, that was far from the extent of the dangerous weather patterns the unlucky squadron had to deal with. Swamp Ghost's engineer, Clarence Lemieux, described the scene in vivid detail to the Smithsonian Magazine. In his words, "It was dark as hell at night. By the time we got there, we lost all the other planes, but ours and one more. We ran into tornadoes, 3 or 4 of them, and we couldn't even see the harbor." The squadron's luck didn't get any better when they reached their target location either. And this was particularly true for Swamp Ghost itself. When it was in the perfect position to drop its payload, its crew discovered they weren't able to open the hatch doors and let any bombs out. Since their first pass over the target was more pacifistic in nature than anyone aboard Swamp Ghost wanted, they decided to make a second pass once they had stopped the doors from jamming. However, this didn't exactly go perfectly either. Although Swamp Ghost was able to drop its bombs on this second pass, it was also struck by an anti-aircraft shell during this run. Although the plane left the target area after this, returning to base would be a harder fight than its crew may have hoped. Although Swamp Ghost managed to make it through this dogfight without being shot down, it wouldn't stay in the air for long, and there appears to be some debate as to why. According to the Los Angeles Times, the plane had been hit enough that it started leaking fuel. Although they soon found what looked like a wheat field, the pilot discovered that it was actually the Agiambo swamp in which he had landed the aircraft. The flying fortress would end up settling in about 4 feet of water, thus beginning its legend as Swamp Ghost. Although all 9 men aboard the flying fortress survived, the conditions of the landing were rough. According to the Smithsonian Magazine, the crew's emergency rations had sunk when the plane landed, meaning they had to begin their journey back to Australia on empty stomachs. Though they hacked through sharp kunai grass for 2 days, rest remained elusive. The mounds they tried to sleep on would sink into the swamp, and even if they found dry ground, relentless mosquitoes kept them awake. Some began hallucinating phantom mess halls. Eventually, they encountered some Papuans chopping wood. Though initially cautious, the crew discovered the group was friendly and allowed them to stay overnight in their village. The next day, the locals helped transport the crew by canoe to an Australian magistrate further down the coast. By then, most of the men were showing symptoms of malaria. When they finally reached Australia, they were hospitalized for a week. Legal gray areas surround these salvage efforts. The U.S. Navy retains ownership of its vehicles, but the Air Force permits salvage of aircraft abandoned before November 1961, unless underwater. The swamp's classification remains uncertain. Despite Eaton's knowledge of the plane's location, the wreck was untouched for nearly 30 years. In 1972, Australian soldiers flying a helicopter on a training mission spotted the B-17, partially submerged. Curious, they landed on its wing and were stunned by how preserved it remained. The sight was eerie. As Smithsonian Magazine detailed, the plane's machine guns were still mounted and loaded. A thermos containing mummified coffee remained inside the cabin. Some even claimed a full ashtray was still intact. The plane appeared virtually undisturbed by time or scavengers. Shortly after its rediscovery, the press began calling it the Swamp Ghost. The name reflected both its ghostly preservation and how the surrounding kunai grass could grow over and conceal it under 12-foot live brush. It would vanish and reappear, like a phantom. Though it had remained hidden for decades, the plane was often clearly visible when not covered by grass. Missionary pilots and travelers used it as a navigational landmark. Its visibility was due in part to the sun bleaching its camouflage paint, leaving behind a reflective silver shell. This gleaming surface became a beacon in the swamp, visible for miles when the grass thinned. Over time, public fascination grew. In 1979, warplane collector Charles Darby included photos of the wreck in Pacific Aircraft Wrecks, amplifying interest. Unfortunately, as interest increased, so did interference. While the aircraft had been largely intact in the 1970s, salvagers gradually stripped its guns, instruments, and flight controls. The frames stayed largely preserved, but much of what had once made the Discovery extraordinary was lost. According to the Smithsonian Magazine, American aviator and builder Alfred Hagen began traveling through Papua New Guinea to find the crash site that had claimed his great-uncle's life during World War II. But when he came across Swamp Ghost, he felt compelled to rescue it. In 2005, Hagen's company, Aero Archaeology, secured an export permit from Papua New Guinea's National Museum and Art Gallery, paying about $100.00. The deal allowed him to disassemble the plane and prepare it for transport. But when Hagen moved the aircraft in 2006, the reaction was not what he expected. Though the salvagers had conducted a traditional ceremony with a local chief to appease spirits of the swamp, others felt they had overstepped. A group led by Augustine Bagazi argued that the plane belonged to the villagers and that Hagen should have paid more. In their view, the plane had the potential to draw tourism and give the area an identity. Once Swamp Ghost reached the coastal town of Leh, it was packed up and prepared for export. However, the shipment was halted after Papua New Guinea's parliament formed a committee that declared the National Museum had no authority to sell the aircraft. They argued that Swamp Ghost was state property, valued at $3.00 to $5 million, and should remain in the country. This led to a 4-year standoff. Over the following years, intense negotiations continued. Eventually, the government and salvage team reached an agreement that allowed Swamp Ghost to be exported to the U.S. In 2010, the aircraft was shipped to California, where it remained in storage for 3 years. Then, in 2013, Swamp Ghost completed its long journey by returning to Oahu, Hawaii, where it had once patrolled for enemy submarines. Rather than restoring it for flight, Swamp Ghost was destined to become a museum exhibit. At the Pearl Harbour Aviation Museum, it was placed in Hangar 79, where restoration began. By 2015, visitors could join special Swamp Ghost tours to view the aircraft up close for a small additional fee. Swamp Ghost's journey is a tale of improbable survival and incredible fortune. Though its first and only major mission ended in a crash landing, it avoided destruction during Pearl Harbor, withstood over 120 bullet strikes, and preserved its structural integrity in a swamp for more than 50 years, all while its crews survived. It's almost unfathomable how many things had to align for this outcome. But thanks to that luck, Americans now have the rare opportunity to witness a legendary warbird up close. When they walk into the Pearl Harbour Aviation Museum, they don't just see an aircraft. They witness history, frozen in time, with bullet holes that echo a battle survived, not just remembered.